I would like to welcome our Universal Design panel. Marco, Karin, Bruce, Mitchell, and Chaandani. I think I got it right. They're going to explore in this session the many facets of using an inclusive universal design approach when creating the spaces where we live, work, play, and learn. Our panelists are going to discuss the benefits of building with the disability community in mind, the positive effects it has on reducing social isolation, and how accessibility is something we all need to consider, regardless of whether it impacts us now or in the future. I'm going to hand it over to you, Marco, to kick things off.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I hope everybody can hear me. Thank you, Amanda. Really happy to be here today, and happy to see some of my panelists are coming in. So yes, you heard, my name is Marco Pasqua. I'm an accessibility and inclusion consultant with my own firm, Marco Pasqua Enterprises, and a firm that I recently started with my wife, who's on the panel today, Karin Pasqua, called Meaningful Access Consulting. We're literally in the same house in different rooms right now. And our 18-month-old daughter is running around. So if my wife turns off her camera at any point, it's because one of us needs to parent. So we're doing our best right now, all things considered. And that's a great segue into what we're going to be talking about today, which is social isolation and the sort of changes that we've sort of witnessed throughout the pandemic, but particularly when it comes to the individuals within the disability community. I'm somebody in the disability community myself. I was born with cerebral palsy and I'm a manual wheelchair user. I'm going to give a quick introduction, unless Amanda, we're asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves. How should we go about that?
I think maybe you should do the intros just in interest of time.
In the interest of time, absolutely. Okay, so it's with great pleasure that I introduce, as I said, my wife, Karin Pasqua of Meaningful Access Consulting, and she's a universal design and accessibility consultant. We've got Bruce. Is it Haden or Haden, Bruce?
It's Haden, so like with a Y, but without a Y in the text.
Okay, there we go. So Bruce Haden, Human Studio Architecture and Urban Design Limited, and he's a principal there. He's a principal architect. Mitchell Reardon of Happy Cities. He's a senior planner of urban design and placemaking. And Chaandani Khan, who's an inspirational speaker and concussion coach. And I wanted to make sure I got that right because we had previous information listed for Chaandani. So there we go. So I am going to start off actually with my wife, not because I have a bias, but because I think it sets the stage for the question that we are going to ask. And so Karin, to you first, hopefully Stella, our daughter's behaving herself. What is universal design and why does it matter outside of the disability community?
Great question. So universal design is the design of spaces and products to benefit everyone, essentially. So when we design for spaces, we want to make sure that they are welcoming to people of all abilities, all ages, all cultural backgrounds, sizes, and using the principles of universal design, it means that the space or the product is simple to use, it's intuitive, and it kind of just makes sense for everybody. And why that matters outside of the disability community, I mean, first and foremost, universal design sort of grew out of the the accessibility disability community. Accessibility being often kind of what I think of like, sure, the place is accessible, we slapped a ramp on it. Universal design welcomes us all to enter the space, use the space to the greatest extent in a meaningful way by all people. And that really matters to all of us. So first and foremost, the disability community is the only community that you can join at any time. You're always welcome. So we're kind of thinking ahead, right? So we all plan on aging. We all have lives that change at any given moment, and we all want to remain welcome in the places that we work, play, learn, and live. So it really does matter to all of us. And myself, as a relatively new mom, features of universal design support me when I've got my arms full with my daughter and I'm pushing the stroller because she wants to walk or be carried. You know, so it's one of those things that whether we're talking about someone with anxiety or other hidden disabilities, we just want to make sure that we all feel just as welcome and just as included. And by being included, we're supporting people out of isolation. Hope that covers
That's
it.
excellent. Yeah, thanks so much for that. And I know it's been challenging with Stella in the background there. Bruce, I'm
Yeah.
going to head over to you because you have a really interesting sort of experience that happened recently. You said in the spring, you finished your role as the jury chair for the Block 2 International Design Competition on Parliament Hill. So what were some of the discussions that you had about accessibility and inclusivity when it comes to democracy? And how do you feel that this would support people with disabilities having the ability to participate in the democratic process from a universal design perspective? Because sometimes we want to be able to vote, we want to be able to make sure our voice is heard, but we could feel isolated if we can't even get inside the building to exercise that. So I'm curious from your perspective what that was like.
Sure. Well, just to give a couple of moments. So Block 2, I don't know if any of you have been to Ottawa, there's Parliament Hill is kind of surrounds the parliamentary lawn. And then Block 2 is a space with a series of heritage buildings and some fairly ratty parking lots. And interestingly, it also includes, so it's directly across the parliamentary lawn. It also includes the Indigenous people space, which is a gift by the Government of Canada to the Indigenous people of Canada as a kind of home, which oddly is actually in a neoclassical building that was originally the American Embassy. So it's actually a very poor fit from an architectural perspective. That's a secondary problem. So the Block 2 site actually wraps both sides of that building, and largely it was the program is conference halls, which are largely publicly accessible, and for special events, not the kind of you can't walk in any time, and offices for senators and members of parliament. And there was an international design competition that was carried out for that site, very, very complex site. And one of the critical issues, I would say we had a huge series of overlapping issue, was the issue of universal design as a kind of test case for accessibility to democracy. So one of the critical points was that really anybody needed to be able to get access to their member of parliament or to another person as needed. And the discussion we had, which was a really interesting one, was about sometimes in the world we have equity of access, but not really equity of joyful access is one way I think about it. That you can have, like, for example, a really fabulous grand stair that welcomes you at the entry, which a number of the schemes had, and the elevator is kind of stuck away at the back. So we had a lot of discussions about this issue, and I would say that we had a total of 11 schemes that we looked at for this site, and different ones handled it in different ways. But I would say that the final scheme, which is a scheme led by an English architect called David Chipperfield, and in conjunction in teamwork with a Zyder Associates, a very good Canadian firm, started that process. But this is where we get into some really interesting complexities of trade-offs. One of the other great public values of this building, of this site, was a whole series of existing heritage buildings, not filling up the whole site, which many people were very passionate about. And one of the problems was, as a real pragmatic consideration, for example, all the heritage buildings had different floor elevations, right? So this is where I think that the issue of universal design is such a complex one, because you can get this kind of collision of different values. There are many people that are extremely passionate about the heritage buildings and also didn't want those buildings to end up just being kind of facadism, right? So in fact, preserving things like the existing floor heights, but integrating them with other buildings to doing this was actually a critical goal. Now, I do believe that it's a workable challenge, but I don't want to understate the challenge of it. And the winning scheme took a stab at that, but it's still very, very difficult. And I know that anybody certainly who's in a wheelchair knows that even if you got ramp access, if it's too long, it's a real problem. So that's right. For us, it was an interesting case because we were looking at, I would say, conflicting public values. That in some senses, I don't want to underestimate the reality that sometimes these conflicting values aren't easy to resolve perfectly. So that's a quick summary, Marco.
Yeah, no, thanks, Bruce. And what's interesting is that it reminds me of how different people in the disability community will say, you can't say this building is accessible blanket statement, because accessibility means different things to different people depending on their needs, right? A couple of years ago, I was on CBC Radio and I was a featured guest with the CEO of the Disability Foundation at the time. And we were talking about how heritage buildings were lacking access for people with disabilities to enter the building because a lot of them used the old turning knob style doors. And if you have a dexterity issue in your hand, or if you have some form of paralysis, a knob is not going to cut it, as opposed to a handle, which is easier to grasp. It's easier to use your elbow or your arm. And I remember a guest called in kind of steaming and said, oh, we can't start just changing doorknobs everywhere because that's the heritage of the building. That's not accurate to what the building is. And I love the president of the Disability Foundation's response at the time. He said, well, the point is that the building itself is that history. So it's no big deal for us to change the knobs and keep the facade of the building looking very close to what it was. If you have such a fascination with doorknobs, we could create an entire section on doorknobs in a museum somewhere. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is create access for everybody. So I just love, it just reminded me everything that you mentioned about stair access and the way in which we used to design. Remember, the way we used to design was not inclusive of people with disabilities, because many people with disabilities were designed out of spaces, and deliberately, because a lot of people with disabilities weren't going out in the public, or were in some ways being shamed. And so we've changed a lot in terms of our mindset, in terms of being inclusive of all people, which helps to obviously reduce social isolation of all members of our community. Actually, with that, I want to segue over to Mitchell, because I think this is great. Mitchell and I, and Karin and I, we've all worked together on projects in the past for design and various things in building communities. So this question is perfect for you, Mitchell. What are some of the benefits that you've seen in building communities and spaces that keep the disability community and especially accessibility in mind?
Thanks, Marco, and great to see all of you here today. It's a really good question. If I was thinking of the most prominent example of this, and one that truly benefits communities of all types, would be curb cuts. And a movement out of Berkeley back in the, I think it was 60s and 70s, and maybe Michigan around veterans before that, actually, where it was, just the streets were walls. You couldn't move from one sidewalk to the next. And people were so fed up with advocating policymakers and decision makers around it, they just started smashing sidewalk edges to start changing that. And in doing so, it made it easier for people who were using wheelchairs or walkers or other mobility devices to cross the street. But it also had a host of other benefits, being able to move a stroller across the street, a shopping cart. So while it had an initial plan for doing so, the benefits were so widespread. I think the same could be said for how you open a door with the power opener. If your hands are full of stuff, whether that's a child, groceries, or otherwise, that's a really helpful way to be able to enter it. And that works great for a wheelchair or otherwise. I feel like, through the pandemic, the inequalities of our society have been laid bare, racial, disability related, and otherwise. And we've just seen how critical it is for people to be able to connect socially. And there's a component of just addressing social isolation and loneliness, which has been described as an epidemic by the former US Attorney General. But this also comes down to creating a more resilient place through the heat dome, which we had here in Vancouver and across southern British Columbia last year. We saw how deadly isolation was. The people most likely to have experienced the most extreme negative consequences, which would be death, were seniors, people living in poverty, people of color, and women. And seeing that the fact that this was linked to a limited connection to their society, that they just didn't have people to ask for help, and people weren't able to check in on them, underlies just how important that addressing this issue to support universal access really is, but how it goes so much further than that. I think one other way that that's really manifests itself in the work that we do at Happy Cities is just thinking about how we communicate invitations to the events that we host, whether that's a pop-up or a workshop or an event that we're hosting for a certain community, where we need to be really conscious of who we're or how we're communicating this invitation, because that's really where it starts. Even pre-design, it's critical to ensure that people feel that their needs are being acknowledged, and in doing so, we make the events better. So, addressing that universal access principle of perceptible information. we make sure that the events are on transit routes. We make sure that there are accessible washrooms there, that the building is going to work for everybody, and we communicate that out. And in doing so, we get better results because we get a broader community coming back to us.
Yeah, I was just going to say, not to boast too much about you and the work of Happy Cities, but honestly, you've been thinking about universal design and accessibility from the get-go. You sought out the advice of Karin and I early on in projects from communities throughout the Lower Mainland. And I think it's really interesting because when you go into some older communities like New Westminster and things like this, it's very hilly, okay? So as a wheelchair user and a guy that has to consider, not only can I get there via transit, but once I get there, am I going to be able to handle the slopes that are, sort of in front of me? And then you have to think of things like weather conditions. How is that going to affect people? What kind of bottlenecking is going to take place based on the design of the space? And how is that going to support people with anxiety or mental health issues? Because a lot of times, invisible disabilities are just as impacted as physical disabilities or otherwise, and we may not even understand it because you can't see it from the naked eye for most people, which again is a great segue. And I'm going to jump over to Chaandani for this question, which is when we look at hybrid work model, Chaandani, how can we use technology to keep mental health a priority while also being flexible to both the employee and the business's needs? Because you as a concussion coach and speaker, I'm sure that you've, like me as a speaker and all those things, have had to adapt throughout the pandemic. And now that we're looking at a world where hybrid isn't going anywhere anytime soon, can you relate to some of the pieces that Mitchell was talking to in terms just of like designing spaces that make sense for everybody in that way?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think that, one of the outcomes from the pandemic, if we, acknowledge the heaviness as well, one of the outcomes is that it kind of evened out the playing field, so to say, for people with various disabilities in their lives. I think that using technology is a fantastic way to be able to bridge that gap, whether it's, sorry, this is just an honest share moment. Being that I do live with an invisible disability, I'll just kind of add this in to just kind of open up to everybody. One thing that I struggle with is compound questions. So, just for example, right now having a few different questions, it's a little bit harder for me to kind of sort in where to jump in. And that's something newer for me. I will just answer this question by saying that I am newer to the disability community myself, although I have been on a recovery journey for about just over 3 years right now. I didn't actually have the cognitive capacity to understand where I was at until probably about a year ago. So it's very much a learning process for me. So please bear with me as I do my best to answer the questions and provide value to our panel today.
No, please. And first of all, let me just interject quickly by saying thank you very much for your transparency and authenticity. For me as a speaker, I love people who are authentic and are willing to lay it out on the line. So never apologize for whatever space or accommodation you need.
Perfect. Thank you. So to kind of jump back into the question you asked me regarding a hybrid model, I think it's fantastic because, if we consider the example of somebody who has physical limitations in their life with the hybrid model where they can perhaps work from home or from a more accessible space, that means that they're able to apply for their dream job. They're able to work with companies or organizations or entrepreneurs that they actually want to be. And so that's fantastic. Would you please ask me the rest of the question?
Yeah, absolutely. So the rest of the question is, I'm just looking for the one that I was going to. Yeah. So how can we use technology to keep mental health a priority while also keeping in mind its flexibility for both the employee and the business's needs?
Yeah, I mean, especially like the first thing that comes to my mind hearing that question again is that multiple groups can benefit. So on one side, we have if you want to say the job seeker, the participants, the space users, and having a chance to have their needs actually understood, considered, and ideally met. And then the other group is actually more on the internal side, and technology, of course, can be the thing that bridges the gap for all parties involved. On the internal side, I consider the teams that are responsible for building with accessibility. And I think it's really important for them to be supported with an accessible culture in their organization, especially if it can reflect in the internal process. as I mentioned before, everybody's on more of an even playing field, if we want to use that metaphor, and they're able to produce the best possible work that they can and serve the community well. So I think that, whether it's a Slack channel, whether it's, check-ins via Zoom, whether it's using adaptive technology for people with, hearing or visual disabilities in their lives, there's a lot of ways that technology can just come in, and the pandemic and the time during COVID has really kind of opened that door, and I guess in a sense kind of mainstreamed that experience for more people. So yeah, I think that we can definitely take from this and continue shaping the future.
Yeah, Chaandani, I think it's really fantastic. In fact, I got to say, like prior to the pandemic, people with in the disability community had been begging for the technology for hybrid work for decades. And it was funny how employers forever were saying it's just not possible. We don't have the infrastructure. And isn't it interesting that about 2 to 3 weeks into the pandemic, miraculously, all of these companies that just didn't have the technology all of a sudden found a way to find the technology. And to your point around accommodations, I want people to think about how, for example, in meetings like today, you can turn on live transcription and have closed captioning in real time. You can also, in some cases, have those transcriptions downloadable after meetings, so that if somebody hasn't disclosed in your organization that they have ADHD or anxiety, or perhaps you just want to be able to review the discussion points that were discussed at your own speed, being able to do that and have transcriptions now in real time is a massive, massive benefit. And I always say to organizations, in my work as an accessibility consultant, when it comes to working in a hybrid space, go to the people who aren't physically in the room first. If they're calling in remotely, they're oftentimes the people who are forgotten about because they're not physically in the space, which is everyone's own bias, right? And so I think that, it's really important to go to those people first, so we make sure that as we evolve into this new hybrid world, we're not forgetting those who aren't physically there with us. But I'm a huge advocate of the fact that in-person meetings are still valuable for some, events, team building, things like that, because I'm all about human connection, which I think is really important in reducing social isolation. Now, Karin, I know that you kind of had some points about, I think it was Mitchell's previous question that was asked. Is there anything you want to chime in on before I jump over to the next question?
Sure. Thanks, Marco. So what I was kind of listening to both Mitchell and Chaandani and thinking to myself about how much through universal design, we have this opportunity for these unintended positive consequences. So when you think about including people, that really is such an expansive way of thinking. And I apologize, my 18-month-old is asking to go play in the courtyard. So speaking of unintended positive consequences, I'll give a couple examples. So Mitchell was talking about the curb cuts. You would think that, a wheelchair user, a mobility device user, that's what the intended use. And of course, brilliantly now, someone pushing a stroller gets to benefit. I'll add one else that you probably hadn't thought about. So there was a study that happened out of Gallaudet. One moment, please. Thank you for your patience. There was a study done out of Gallaudet University in the States. Gallaudet University is a university for people who are deaf. And once curb cuts came in, all of a sudden there was far less injuries. And they were wondering why, because users who are deaf and they're signing to their companions, they're looking not where they're going. So all of a sudden curb cuts are now preventing injuries from the deaf community. Unintended positive consequence. I'll give you one more quick example just for fun, because social isolation in some respects or social reintegration, shall we say, is also a positive unintended consequence of universal design. Again, my 18-month-old. So our nursery is built universally designed. Shocking. My husband uses a wheelchair. The crib is elevated. It has bifold doors, intended for him to be able to support her and to support with parenting. The best part of that is that I think everybody should have one now. So if you have a child on the way, highly recommend an elevated crib, because I'm probably one of the few moms who hasn't had a back injury pulling their child in and out of a deep crib, because now I can do it actually at my height. So this is the beautiful aspect, that when we really think about how do we include everybody, it actually means that everybody is included in even a better way than we could have initially planned for. I will now mute myself because I need to just chat with my daughter.
Thanks, Karin. And yeah, to give people some context, that is a really awesome experience being able to have an elevated crib, because Karin is actually able to open those bifold doors. And even when Stella is upset, she's able to just lie next to her, right on the mattress portion of the crib, right next to her, consoling her. So there's all these unintended benefits, including the fact that the underside of the elevated area, we can now double as a play space with curtains as Stella gets older. So it can age with her and she can understand the benefits of accessibility. We even take her onto some walkthroughs and job sites with us, and she's listed on our website as a junior associate, because we want to be able to integrate that of working moms and dads and how they work within the space. Speaking of working within the space, I want to jump back to Bruce for a second. Bruce, in your work, can you describe maybe a project or a space that you believe has utilized the core principles of universal design and why you think they did that, or maybe why it was a success?
Sure. I was thinking about this question because, these are always questions that allow one to brag if you want to. And I actually don't kind of want to do that. I think what I'd like to do is, again, focus on some of the challenges when a little bit of these ideas hit the ground. I'll talk about that. But I want to actually follow up on some of the things that Karin and Mitchell said. And it just goes to a little bit of a use of terminology. I actually don't use the word disability community very specifically. And the reason I don't use that is I think implicit in that is that there's a big group of normal people, and then there's a little group of disabled people. And I actually don't agree with that position. I actually think we're all disabled on one level or another. And sometimes, and I think of that, I mean, in my mind, it's kind of most clearly in my mind in the kind of mental health issue. Like, if you just think about it respectively, we've all had periods of kind of, whether we choose to call it just depression or sadness, like, we all have that moment. And, I think of, for example, I have hearing aids. I had hearing aids for many years. And it's not a particularly highly visible disability, but it's absolutely a disability that affects my day-to-day functioning. But I don't tend to think of myself as part of the disability community. So some of it is, and it really goes back to this core thing, is that when we're designing, what we want to do is design and recognize the way the core principle I think about it is just to recognize that people's ability to do very simple things like move around spaces is very different across the spectrum. Perhaps the most extreme example, Marco, is someone in a wheelchair, but of course there are many other ones. And I often think of just the population. We haven't touched on aged populations, right? That there's so many, simply as we all get older, our grip strength reduces, our ability to do stairs, all of those things reduce. And yet someone who is sort of 65 isn't necessarily considered part of the disability community, but it really in fact is really. Anyway, so that's the precursor. So I was thinking about this question. I thought actually of a building where we had a bunch of challenges and some successes. In my previous work as a partner at a large firm called Dialogue, I was one of the 3 lead designers on the UBC student nest. And the nest is a very interesting building, in part because it has, you've got a huge influx of student population that change over year over time. The previous, whoever was in for our previous speakers who talked about consistency, social connections in part about staying in the same place for a long time. And universities are in fact exactly the opposite of that. So we had a very large number of cultural differences between the students, really strong and interesting, a lot of attention to things like universal design. And we had a difficult site, which was inherently vertical. So these buildings, from I would say both an accessibility and a sociability perspective, actually kind of want to be horizontal in simple terms. It enhances social connection and makes just kind of the simple social context. And we couldn't do that. We had to have one of the ways we dealt with that was we have a lot of, it's kind of a large scale atrium. And one of the things I was proud of is actually in the building yesterday, because we were working on another UBC project and I took some team members there. And what happened was that you can be stand on the very top of the building, about 5 floors up, and you can look all the way down through the building and still recognize someone at the lower levels, which I think is, from a social connection perspective, is great. But I'm going to speak about a very, very specific and interesting trade-off we wanted, which was between sustainability and disability access. The students were very passionate, and the building ended up being, it's a LEED Platinum building, very passionate about the issue of sustainability. One of the things in sustainability is you actually want to minimize the use of elevators. simply because they use electricity don't. So we do have a kind of very large feature stair. But the way we dealt with that is that directly adjacent to the large feature stair, I'd still say we could probably get a slightly better job of making them visible, is a glass walled elevator. And so part of that was simply that the experience of going up the stairs where you kind of get a panorama looking down in this large atrium is, I'd say, very successful, and supports as well one of the things that I think is really important in social connection, which is just the amount of time you spend visible to others. We often think of sociability features, and we think about it more as like, how much time can you just have a chance to see people, literally, because you can't see people, you can't talk to them. But anyway, the way we dealt with it was to make sure that the elevators are visible, prominent, and delightful, which I think is a really important aspect of this. Is the question that so often gets ignored is not how do you just make it possible, but how do you make it delightful? And I would say that we were as successful in that, but I don't want to underestimate the real challenges that come when principals hit real very specific conditions, like the fact that we had a building with an inherent high degree of social connection essential that needed to be vertical.
Yeah, no, I find that super, super interesting. And in fact, just the idea of being able to see people makes you feel connected in your community, that you're not alone. That in and of itself is going to reduce social isolation, because you may be a people watcher when you're out in the community. You might like just watching what people are up to, going for a walk, going for a stroll. And the second that we're in these very brutalistic sort of designed spaces that are just purely concrete, that take us out of nature, that take us into spaces that are not connecting people, I think it subconsciously does something to our mental health, even if you wouldn't identify with having mental health challenges, right? So 100%, I give you kudos for the spaces that you're designing and why you're designing it that way. Mitchell, I want to jump back over to you because I know you've done a lot of work in this space. So over the past 2.5 years, and you kind of maybe touched on this already, but we've seen the effects that social isolation can have on our connection to others in our communities. So how do you think that building inclusive and universally designed communities can help reduce actually socialization? I guess I'm getting to the core of what this panel is all about. Like, how is it that we design universally, and what does that mean in terms of the reduction of social isolation, even based on the work that you've done?
Thanks, Marco. Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and one that's certainly been prominent for us over the last, I would like to say pre-pandemic as well, but especially in the time since. One way that it has really come through for us is we do a lot of work around street transformation and placemaking along the streets, first with temporary plazas and patio spaces, and now helping cities to establish their new permanent patio programs as a result of the popularity that has resulted. And these outdoor spaces, we feel, are just so important. According to the US president, the pandemic is over, but not necessarily everybody is feeling that way. And so being able to connect outdoors remains critical. And for a lot of people with disabilities, there are multiple factors at play, and that can include immunocompromisation. So having comfortable, accessible spaces is really vital to ensuring that we are able to connect with one another. In doing so, we need to make sure that those spaces are working for everybody. In some cases, that's curb cuts. In a lot of cases, that can be just ensuring that any extension of the sidewalk is level with the curb and easy to access, that you can turn a wheelchair around within that space. So we've seen a lot of that, and I think being able to learn from folks like you and with just all sorts of wonderful community partners has been just such an important and inspiring part of the work that we do. So this is our opportunity as a planning and design firm to integrate this better, to elevate the expertise that people with lived experience with, say, facing mobility barriers may have. One really inspiring example actually is Wavefront Center for Communication Accessibility. We were working on a project called Designing for Difference with the City of Vancouver about how to make public space more accessible. And the facility that they have, it's, I think, maybe 5th in Quebec, something around there anyway, Mount Pleasant. It's a brand new facility, they have, this is, I think, probably the best example of universal design that I'm familiar with, at least in Vancouver, where, you know, they have high quality wayfinding. They've used a lot of yellow, recognizing that yellow is one of the last colors that a lot of people with visual impairment lose. They of course have braille and that to help move people around. But, you know, the hearing loops, the way the building walls don't have corners, that they curve on the inside, so that if you're in a wheelchair, you're not trying to make that 90-degree turn, you're just making a fluid arc around it, has been really inspiring. And so I think we've felt so privileged to be able to work with experts in this area, and in doing so, make new social connections for ourselves, but also be able to apply them in a lot of the work that we're doing to ensure that these benefits can be shared more broadly with all of the communities that we serve.
Yeah, that's a fantastic answer. And actually in the chat, it looks like Anita was asking, you know, in terms of the term people with disabilities, is that a better way to do it? So my logic to that is it depends. Okay. I adopt sort of the Rick Hansen Foundation's approach, which is the use of person first language. So person with a disability, person who uses a crutch or cane, as opposed to the UK's approach is actually identity first. So disabled person. And to Bruce's point earlier, you know, about the language, absolutely, you're right that some people could look at the word disability community as reductive. But actually, I look at it as more inclusive because I'm proud to be part of the disability community myself. But again, it comes down to each person. So if you're in doubt, if you have a friend or colleague who you work with who has a disability or a assistive device or some other device that they're utilizing, feel free to ask them, you know, like obviously don't do it rudely. Ask them how you would ask any human being a question, right? Oh, that's a really interesting thing. Or is there a way in which I can refer to your disability that you prefer? Make sure that they know that you're taking into consideration their needs and their humanity first before anything else. Otherwise, we're going to get lost in all the ways in which we can label everything. To that, Bruce, you mentioned to me that there's a bit of a follow-up that you wanted to do as far as what Mitchell was talking about.
Yeah,
so I'd love to throw it over to you.
Sure. Just really briefly, we're huge fans of Happy Cities work when we collaborate with them in a couple of different circumstances. And part of our focus is kind of more specifically on the interior buildings. They focus more on the urban design realm. But one of the things that I think is kind of a parallel that I want, or a spectrum that I want to talk about that people often don't talk about in terms of, and it's not a disability specific one, but I think it's an important one, which is introversion versus extroversion. Because I think it's so parallel with things. And I think that one of the things we tend to fail to do in the workplaces, in our cities, and in buildings to some extent, is to really allow social connection to occur at different scales. Sometimes we want to be part of a really giant group of people having an amazing time. Other times we want to be able to have an opportunity to have an intimate conversation with that. And I think acoustics is important to that. So one of the things we did with the Nest, for example, is we have an introverted side and an extroverted side. So there's a side that's consciously smaller group gathering, more intermittent scale, still very nice. And there's a side that's inherently very, very vibrant. But I think that's a spectrum that we often don't think about. And it's tied in with a lot of these different things in terms of social connection specifically.
Absolutely. In fact, Bruce, you sparked something in me because I think about as an accessibility consultant, some of the winning spaces that Karin and I have seen over the years. And one of the spaces, and I think Karin's going to talk about this, she's delivering a keynote later today, is the Vancouver Airport. For those of you who don't know, the Vancouver Airport rated 96% on the gold scale for the Rick Hansen Foundation Accessibility Certification Program. So basically what that means is 96% above code regulation to what we consider meaningful access, which is why Karin and I are so moved by the word meaningful accessibility, and that's why we named our company that, right? But the reason why VR ranks so highly for that on that scale is simply because of the fact that they've designed things that you can't even see. Bruce, you mentioned about acoustics. You know, a lot of the art pieces that hang in the ceiling of YVR Airport actually serve double function for both beauty as well as acoustic reduction, so that you're not getting a lot of those echoes. Now, next time you're in the airport, everybody, I want you to pay attention to the type of flooring that you're on, because it's very intentional. Okay, when you're going and heading towards information desks, all of those spaces are tiled areas. Okay, if you're going into storefronts and things of this nature, it's either carpeted or hardwood floor. And so there is actually a textural experience that you're going through when you're going through the airport that is not only reducing sound and things you wouldn't even recognize, but it's actually there to indicate for people who are blind and who are using white canes, the differentiator between the textures on the floor. So you know you're actually headed in the right direction based on, if you have low vision, based on the color that is being used, but if you're completely blind, based on the texture that you feel. So that's going to blow your mind. I don't necessarily advocate for everyone to close their eyes while walking through the airport because it can already be stressful enough as it is. But I really want you to take a moment next time you have an opportunity to scale yourself back and really think about, wow, how can we integrate things that we wouldn't even recognize in the spaces that we work, live, play, and learn, and do it in such a way that increases accessibility, reduces isolation, reduces anxiety, but gives everyone a sense of quiet. Now, I don't want to throw too much shade, but my least favorite airport in all of North America, if not the world, is Pearson Airport in Toronto. It is the most clinical, sort of medical lighting and lots of sounds. 3 o'clock in the morning, they're still paging people. I used to work very closely with the CEO of the Vancouver airport. And I remember he and I were having coffee one time and he said to me, you know, when this space was designed, we deliberately wanted it to reflect what British Columbia means to us, which is nature, which is quiet. And we specifically make choices at particular hours to not page people over the audio system so that it doesn't increase that anxiety. We specifically have benches that are intended for you to sleep on so that you can relax. So there's all these things that you can notice for YVR as to why it makes you feel so comfortable when you're already stressed out in a high stress situation when it comes to travel. So that's just a microcosm of things you can consider and how maybe could you apply some of those learnings in your own workspaces, even if people are working hybrid. So something to really, really consider. Chaandani, do you have something to add here? Yeah, absolutely, please.
So I'm very lit up by what you're saying because I actually had just thought about airports just last week. I won't say which one, but I was flying through a different Canadian airport and I was just, you know, for me personally, again, I'm in the invisible disability category, if you want to say, or group or community. And so I struggle with things like visual noise, overwhelm, sounds, acoustics as well. My hearing has changed since my injury. And so I used to travel quite a bit and I've always known this about Vancouver Airport, but specifically nowadays as well, just how calm it is in there. And there are alcoves for people who, like myself, maybe, you know, you can't tell by looking at me because I sound fine and I look fine and all these, you know, buzzwords. But I'm able to get into an alcove where it's kind of quieter, or I can actually find a plain wall to face instead of having a bunch of distractions on it. And yeah, so I just wanted to say that, you know, the design that Bruce and Mitchell are talking about, as well as Marco and Karin, it's so important. And for people like myself in this community of invisible disability, we often find benefits with that as well. And one thing that I'm personally wanting to do as I kind of rise and create this platform for my community is to really integrate, you know, the invisible side of things as well, and invite all of our change makers today to consider the invisible pieces and just how there is or there could be a connection. Yeah, that's just wanted to jump on that and just share. Thank you.
100%. And just really quickly to your point, do you feel like spaces like that reduce social isolation because it actually makes you want to go to those spaces more simply because you don't have that anxiety that you may have had previously?
Yeah, you know what? Yes, it makes it not necessarily that I want to, but that I know that I'm capable of doing it. For me, still, it's an absolute huge struggle, if I'm honest. I will look like this. I will look composed and just like a person walking, you know, down the ramp, getting onto the airplane. But yeah, things like even like cafes, for example, that's something that I personally stopped being able to go to and to enjoy because it is so overwhelming. And I came from a background of working in events and working in crowds of 500,000 people. So it's really been quite eye-opening for me to see that difference.
Yeah, huge. Okay, so I'm cognizant of time here. I believe we have another 5 minutes officially, I believe, until we go into the Q&A session, but I can be corrected if I'm wrong. I want to do a bit of a rapid fire for the last question for everybody, and everybody just chime in as you see fit. So do any of you have any quick wins that you're willing to share when it comes to being more inclusive design from a built environment or a mental health perspective that you could share that would really support anyone listening today or watching today in their own workspaces? Who wants to chime in first to put you on the spot?
Can jump in.
Yeah, sure.
Two real quick ones. So when we conduct pop-ups, we try to create these engaging events that people actually want to attend, not to give us information, but because they're actually fun to be at. When we do that, we are really cognizant that there are different abilities that are going to be present and need to be catered to at our events. And so we ensure that if we're on the sidewalk or on the street, actually, that there's a curb cut nearby. We put signage at different levels, recognizing that you might be standing and see it, you might be using a wheelchair and you want to be able to see it. You put it on the ground so you can look down and see it. We use a lot of chalk where we're doing, interim placemaking activities, and on the great advice from you, we also have the chalk holders to allow people who are using wheelchairs to be able to sit in the chair and draw with it. So just making those steps to ensure that the events are more inclusive. And all this is typically to feed into public space design. And so it came up before, but just creating a spectrum of space from being able to fully participate to fully retreat. We do our best to include those, and tiered seating, greenery, a more active area and a less active area are all components of that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Anyone else have any quick wins while you were thinking about the work that you do or the spaces? If not, I can jump in.
I can chime in, Marco, real quick.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. I don't know if it really is such a big win. It was just more of initiative. When I was helping out an apparel company and looking for athletic people, trainers, the team that I had were all young, 25, 30-year-olds. And the initial thing that they did was gather, the first couple of dozen, but the first couple of dozen were, very good looking, younger, white people. And then I sat the team down and just said, okay, we need to go out and invite certain amounts of people, minorities, but people also with disabilities, because just you have a disability doesn't mean that you're not a trainer and not working out, and find these people and then invite them in instead of like just making it open for them, but actually us physically going to people and saying, we want you with us. And so even today's workout session with Brett Price, most people know that Brett Price was very open about it, suffered from tremendous mental health issues. Used to be about 350 pounds or 400. He's totally jacked right now. You would never know it that this is where he came from. We had two people in wheelchairs with us, people that had amputees. We just physically went out and searched them all. So when we created this, we called them connectors, these community, people could see that, you may have disabilities, but that doesn't mean that can't be overcome. And to Chaandani's thing, we actually even sought out people with concussions. One of the girls that I hired actually had a brain injury that actually changed her personality, which no one knew. And she wouldn't tell people. And I told her, there's nothing going to improve unless you're open about it and transparent about it. People would just look at you. She was 6 foot and beautiful girl. And they would just look and say, what's your problem? I would have to tell them, wow, you have no idea what the problem is, and you shouldn't assume that just because they're 6 foot and gorgeous that it means that their life is perfect, because it absolutely isn't. So with a bit of coaching and with some professional help, she would actually disclose to people, just understand this, I have a brain injury,
right? So
I can't do these certain things. It may seem that I'm kind of wacky, but I'm not. It's just my head got hit.
I love the transparency there. And Alex, thank you for being a pseudo panelist that's just jumped on board to give us some insights there. I love that. I love the integration. Karin, did you have your hand up? Do you have a quick win you want to share before we jump into some Q&A for folks? And moderators in the room, let me know if we do have still time for some questions. I want to make sure that we're on track here.
Yep, we're on track. We've got till noon, so we'll keep time for you. We're doing good.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Go ahead, Karin.
So my favorite quick win to always talk about. So the Surrey, the North Surrey Sport and Ice Complex, brand new facility here in Surrey, is exceptional. It is one of the only facilities in North America that is ready for para ice hockey without making any changes. So prior to the pandemic, one of the things we did when the facility opened was we hosted a all ability skate. And we welcome the entire community free of charge. Come and join us on the ice, celebrate Canada's favorite pastime, try it out. One of the things we advocated for was allowing our sleds to be available for people, not just our skates. So again, speaking to my favorite unintended positive consequences of universal design, what we experienced one time, we expected that the sleds would be used by individuals with disabilities. And what we encountered was they were being used by everyone. And my favorite moment was when a grandmother got herself into a sled so that she could participate on the ice with her grandson and her daughter. So we had 3 generations of brand new Canadians on the ice participating together. And my heart just exploded and melted at the same time, because it was like the most perfect thing I could have experienced. So that's my quick win. And just before I finish talking, thank you all for your patience with me being on and off camera and while I support my daughter. So thank you all for that consideration.
This is the thing that we've learned throughout the pandemic is people actually, I think in some ways have become a little bit more authentic and more human, because we all knew that work-life balance exists before the pandemic, but now people are much more understanding of the integration of our family life when it comes to work life, the works that we do, everything like that. So I think that that's been really great. Any final comments in this regard before we head over to Q&A? From the audience? Does anyone else? Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, before passing over to audience, I'm happy to hold space for everyone.
No. I think we do have at least a final comment here, and I think it'd be great if you gave us the final comment.
Okay, just something that I've noticed. It's more so not me creating this for people, but me so being on the user end. I've just noticed that, as I just said, holding space is something that I find is happening more and more, whether that's, booking a reservation at a restaurant and me calling to say, hey, I have, various hearing impairments now, and asking for a space against a wall away from the action, and just finding that they hold that space and they're very open, or connecting with different people in all different ways. I'm finding that that's incredible, and just really want to, thank everyone for doing that, and remind and encourage that if you aren't sure, as Marco mentioned earlier, just ask. Even if you just ask up front, the worst you're going to hear is someone saying, no, I'm okay, I don't have any special requirements or any needs. But when people have asked me that, I felt that that's been so helpful, because I still struggle with sharing what I'm tripping over in my daily life. And as we saw with my little transgression earlier, I'm very much kind of workshopping how to do this the right way. And if someone opens that up, holds the space, it makes it a lot easier on me as well.
Yeah, Chaandani, a lot of the work that I also do, it has nothing to do with the physical space, and has to do with HR policy and inclusive hiring. And, HR managers constantly come up to me and say, but Marco, we can't ask somebody, do you have a disability? What are you not telling us here? That's illegal. So my answer to them is exactly what you just said. You don't have to say the word disability at all. You can say, has there been accommodations both in your work or in your personal life that have supported you to be at your best? And are there ways in which we can accommodate that here? Right there, I didn't use the word disability once, but you're opening the door with authenticity for somebody to say, actually, well, yes, I would love to have a standing desk because my hips get sore, or I'd love to have my monitors on on a arm instead of a pedestal so that I can bring it closer to my face or further away depending on my needs. So I think that really we just have to break down this idea that these are not well asks. You can't say that in the workplace, and rather, how can we remember that we're not just dealing with people and numbers, but human beings first? And I can't stress that enough, because people are just reduced so much to the role that they do, and that's it, 9 to 5. But when we hang up our hat at the end of the day, we're still people and we still have lives. And so we can still have that exist in our work and in what we do to help reduce isolation and everything else when it comes to being inclusive of people with disabilities. So I'm going to stop.
People are people, treat people like people.
Exactly. So I'm going to stop there. We have about 5 minutes left of the session. I want to give some time to the audience. Do you have any questions? And let's just make it open-ended. Ask whoever you like, whatever you like. I'll give it a minute here. And again, this is not a time to be shy, because if you have a question, we're probably the right people to ask now, as opposed to getting yourself out there in the wild and then feeling like, oh, darn, I didn't actually take the opportunity to ask a question. It also doesn't have to be a question. It could be an aha moment. If there's an aha moment or something that you didn't even realize through this conversation, that now you're like, I'm going to reflect on that a bit differently, we can discuss that as well. So does anyone have anything that they'd like to share?
Yeah, I would like to know, Karin, your child's name.
This is Stella.
Stella.
Hi.
Hello, Stella.
Everybody say hi, Stella.
Hello.
Can you wave? You say hi? I know she's playing shy.
I only say that because I babysit, my wife and I babysit our grandchildren because we have 3 of them. One are a set of twins at the same age. The twins are the same age as your Stella. So same thing. But I include them on my Zoom calls because it makes everybody laugh, especially with twins.
That's awesome, Alex. Thanks for that. If people want to chime in, they can. I do want to address some points that were made throughout the talk that I think are great to get people thinking while we have a few minutes left. I love that we said, and Bruce, this was you, I believe, everybody needs and deserves access to their member of parliament. I think that is interesting. It's something that you wouldn't necessarily think about. Event routes, we have to make sure that they're accessible, including the routes to and from the space. And Mitchell, I really was inspired from you in that, in terms of considering things like accessible transit and the routes to getting to those spaces where you want to be included and not feel isolated. We talked about how everyone is on an even playing field when you design with universally in mind. And Karin, you mentioned there's unintended benefits or consequences. So when you improve accessibility for one subset of individuals, you may not know, but you could be improving other aspects of the space for other individuals as well. So I think that that's really great. Let's see here. Kate says, I also think accessibility in regards to feeling safe is important. Having several entries and exits or well-lit rooms in public spaces, 100%. There's something in the industry we call CPTED, which is crime prevention through environmental design. And so by that, we mean the appropriate amount of lighting in spaces, not making it so that strangers or assailants can tuck themselves behind small corners or things to jump out at you. So, these things not only benefit accessibility and the sense of isolation, but they also benefit people's safety as well. And so, it's kind of interesting when you kind of wear that lens or that hat and thinking, what are all the aspects of how we can improve a space so that we can make it better for everybody. Ronald asks, do you have some advice on how, in the pursuit of helping, someone or a business might go to onboard with their policies and procedures? Absolutely, that's one of the things that I kind of specialize in. There's a couple of organizations that I would recommend, Ronald. One is accessibleemployers.ca. Basically, sorry, I meant overboard. Oh, I see. Without going overboard. Yeah. So accessibleemployers.ca as well as hirefortalent.ca are some great resources. They're free resources for all employers. And actually for hirefortalent.ca, I actually wrote their entire section and toolkit on accommodations for persons with disabilities. So toolkit number 13 around accommodating in the workplace, including onboarding. But as far as not going overboard, use your best guess. I always say to CEOs and business leaders, if you're going to make a policy available to one group of people, make it available to everyone. So for example, if part of your process is working with a third-party organization like the Neil Squire Society when it comes to onboarding and determining, say, workplace accommodations. I remember when I was onboarded as an accessibility consultant for accessibleemployers.ca, we were working with 25 of the biggest change-driven companies across BC, and I was being housed at Van City Credit Union in downtown Vancouver. And so they wanted me to be working there constantly out of office. And I remember them saying, Marco, we have this onboarding process where we have a occupational and physical therapist kind of assess what you're going to be doing for work. And I thought it was being overboard or tokenism because I was the guy in the wheelchair. But they explained to me that this is the onboarding process for every employee that joins and gets onboarded to the company, because they want to make sure that you might not even think of things that may support you in the workplace. And through that interaction, I was able to get a laundry list of suggestions of what might be able to help me in my role before I even started 2 weeks before. So by the time I actually was onboarded properly and got in there, all those accommodations were already adapted by the facilities team before I even stepped foot in the door. So just something to consider as we close up the conversation here. Thank you very much, everybody. I think we've reached our time, but of course, if you have further questions, you can reach out to the organizers at the Brands for Better team, or you can obviously go to each of our respective websites. I believe that each and every one of us are either on LinkedIn or out there on the internet, or you can Google my name or Meaningful Access and you can find us, but we would love to hear from you. So thank you so much to my panelists. Thank you so much to the audience for being active listeners, and enjoy the rest of the event today. Thanks.
Thank you, Marco.